And now on to our program. And first, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening. She's one of 7 children born to German and Norwegian immigrants who settled in Minnesota. Heidi Heitkamp was the first woman elected to the US Senate from North Dakota, and as a moderate Democrat, she served from 2013 to 2019. She's a graduate of the University of North Dakota and Lewis and Clark College. Senator Heitkamp was an attorney for the EPA and tax commissioner in the 1980s. She was just telling us some stories about that, and was an active member of the North Dakota Democratic Nonpartisan League. She served as North Dakota Attorney General from 1992 to 2000 and led the state's efforts to seek damages from tobacco companies. She's a pro-business Democrat. She often holds independent views in the US Senate on issues from energy to corporate taxes and banking regulation to gun control. With her state leaning further to the right in her opposition to Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, Senator Heitkamp lost her re-election bid in 2018. She's now in a much better spot as a CNBC contributor. That was me ad-libbing, sorry. She's now a CNBC contributor, and in 2022 was named director of the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. And on to our speaker, David Brooks. When he was an undergraduate, also at the University of Chicago, where he described himself as having majored in history and celibacy. I didn't write this. My son just said this is where fun goes to die. He was selected to represent the communist philosophy in a debate with Nobel laureate and free market economist Milton Friedman. He lost. It was the beginning of his nuanced journey with conservatism. Born in Toronto, Canada, he and his brother grew up in New York before moving to the Philadelphia Main Line when he was 12. His father taught English literature at New York University, while his mother studied 19th century British history at Columbia. David started his career as a police reporter at the City News Bureau of Chicago, a local wire service that supplied the daily papers and trained both Mike Rocco and Kurt Vonnegut. Wow. An earlier UFC encounter with Bill Buckley led to an internship at the conservative stalwart, the National Review. From there, he moved to the conservative Hoover Institution at Stanford and wrote movie reviews for the Washington Times. After doing book and movie reviews at the Wall Street Journal, the Journal sent David to Brussels, where he covered Russia. In 2003, he was recruited by the New York Times to take the place of outgoing political columnist William Safire. I was looking for the kind of conservative writer that wouldn't make our readers shriek and throw the paper out of the window, said then New York Times editorial page editor Gail Collins. So they got him. In 2008, he called John McCain's running mate Sarah Palin a cancer on the Republican Party. He's been writing for the Times for over 20 years and is also a regular with Jonathan Capehart on the PBS NewsHour. David has observed 10 presidential elections, has taught at Duke, at Yale, and is currently a senior fellow and senior advisor with the University of Chicago's Leadership and Society Initiative. He's written 6 books, including his latest, How to Know People, and cover all aspects of politics and life with an intolerance for extremes, but understanding and appreciation for its genesis. When asked what David thinks of charges that he's not a real conservative, he says that if you define conservatives by the support for Republican candidates or the belief that tax cuts are the correct answer to all problems, I guess I simply don't fit that agenda. But I do think that I'm part of a long-standing conservative tradition of Edmund Burke and Alexander Hamilton. Welcome to the Economic Club of Chicago, David.
Well, good evening, and thank you so much for this great invitation. And I get to do one of the favorite things, which is ask a journalist questions. Because as a politician, you don't get that opportunity very often. We are so excited to be here, and it is at a very critical and important time in our democracy's history. And so I don't want to start with your bio and all these wonderful books that you've written and what you did when you were in college. We heard not much, not anything exciting. So I guess we got that covered. Anyway, but I didn't write it. I do want to talk about where we are right now as a country politically. You've seen a lot of history, as I have. You're a little younger than I am, but you certainly have been in the game much longer than I have. And, you know, everybody says this is the most important election of our time. This is like democracy's in the balance. Things are going to go to hell. This is just, I mean, and you wake up every morning and you just have this sense of gloom and doom. Do you share that opinion, or do you have do you have maybe a more nuanced view that you can offer tonight?
I've never been introduced as a celibate before. Yeah. First, I should thank, when I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And so, without them, I wouldn't be here tonight, and I hope none of my college girlfriends are in the audience. My favorite saying, where fun goes to die, is the most famous saying about U of Chicago, but my favorite saying, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so I was the era of Mike Royko when I was here, and Bob Greene, Kupchik. It was an era of legendary columnists. And so it was just, I fell in love with Chicago. I came here as an unbelievable New York snob, but fell in love. And now, even being around here, it's fun being back at the university because it's where I spent my, when you're 21, you have your dreams.
Yeah.
And to walk, I literally sat in the same desk in the library where I used to sit when I was 20 this morning. And it's just so moving to be back here. And also to be reminded what a strong civic infrastructure there is in this city. This organization, the Community Trust. So as for whether we should just go home and suck on the gas pipe, I've been helped through the last 4 years by a book I read a number of years ago called The Politics of Disharmony by a very famous political scientist named Samuel Huntington, who was at Harvard. And he wrote this book in 1981, and he said, I've noticed this pattern in American history that every 60 years or so, America tends to go through what he called a moral convulsion. And at a moral convulsion, people get disgusted with established power. A new, highly moralistic generation comes on the scene. There's a new form of communications technology. Groups that have been excluded demand to be included. And he said this happened in the 1770s with the American Revolution. It happened in the 1830s with the age of Jacksonian populism. It happened in the 1890s with the Progressive Era, and happened in the 1960s. And so he said, I don't know, and he's writing in 1981, and he said, I don't know if this cycle, this 60-year pattern holds, but if it does, sometime around 2020, America will go through another moral convulsion. And so when I read that, I was like, pretty good call. And the good news is you come out of it. And so I do think we're going through a period where we had a culture, I would say, of extreme individualism and not enough interest in community. And that lasted for about 60 years, and it gave us a lot of freedom, but it also weakened the bonds between us. And so we had to chop that up, and we've been chopping it up, and now we're having a big fight about what kind of community we want to be. So the good news is you come out. But if you're living through 1968, if you're living through 1873, if you're living through 1776, it looks awful. And it's awful to go through it, but you come out.
Yeah, I'm just going to maybe channel some of the skepticism that we're going to come out of this, and maybe put on my Eeyore hat and say it's really bad out there. This has been the most divisive time that I've ever been involved in politics. Neighbor not talking to neighbor, people sitting, I grew up in a small town, you sit around a table, I always say, they have their political fights, but, they figure out how to get the street lights working and the church roof fixed, and, they get stuff done. Let me tell you, they aren't even sitting at that table in small town America anymore. And so do you really think that this time is comparable, given kind of where we are with this move towards autocracy, the move towards, wanting a strong man to represent us. I mean, do you really think it's comparable, David?
I'm known as the unrealistic optimist at the Times, so I can do the bad news. If you want me to tell the bad news story, it goes something like this. The most significant resource that any society has is trust, and trust in each other. And so if you asked Americans 2 generations ago, do you trust your neighbors? 60% of Americans said, yes, I trust my neighbors. Now it's down to 30% and 19% of millennials. And so the younger you go, the more distrusting people are. And if you ask millennial and Gen Z, do you agree with the following statement, most people are selfish and out to get you? 73% of millennial and Gen Z say yes, most people are selfish and out to get you. And so that's just a hard way to go through life. And when you have low trust, it's hard to do deals. It's hard to organize your community. It's just hard. You go through life afraid of the people around you, so you get angry and isolated, and you reject the thing you want most, which is human connection. And so to me, when I look at our politics, and again, I'll pivot to the hopeful in a second, but in a healthy society, first of all, to me, the number one problem in the country is derived from this lack of trust. And it is that rising mental health problems, rising suicide, the number of Americans who say that they have no close personal friends is up by 4-fold since 2000. The number of Americans not in a romantic relationship is up by 1/3 since 2000. The number of Americans who rate themselves in the lowest happiness category is up by 50% since 2000. So we're in the middle of some sort of societal and relational problem. And to me, that's underlying the problem in our politics. Mm-hmm. So in a healthy society, you have the politics of redistribution. How high should taxes be? Where should we spend our money? That's a healthy society. We don't have that. We have the politics of recognition, that I want to shame you and feel affirmed. We have a kind of politics where people are trying to fill a hole in their soul with politics. And so politics, if you're left naked and alone and distrustful, politics seems to offer you the illusion that you can have belonging because you're part of Team Red or Team Blue. But you don't really have community, you're just hating the same people. It gives you the illusion of moral action, but you're not sitting with the widow or feeding the poor, you're just indignant in front of the TV screen. And so politics, if you're trying to use politics to fill the hole in your soul, you're asking more politics that can offer you. And I read a study by a guy named Ryan Streeter who found that people who say they're lonely are 7 times more likely to volunteer for politics than other Americans. Wow. So it attracts people who are just looking for some sense of belonging. And so that's, to me, the dysfunction. Now, on the positive side, oh, I forget. There is no positive side. Now, on the positive side, in 2017, I founded this nonprofit called Weave, the Social Fabric Project. And so we go around to neighborhoods and we say, who's trusted here? And every place you go, they give you names. And they're people who are in the local communities building trust and community. And they're everywhere. We ran into, here in Chicago, a woman named Aisha Butler, who was living in Englewood, and everybody should applaud Aisha Butler. And so she was going to leave, because tough neighborhood, violent, she's a little girl, and she's about to leave, and she looks across at an empty lot across the street and says, I'm not leaving this. There's a little girl playing with a broken bottle, and she says to her husband, we're not leaving, we're not going to be another family who left. So she Googles volunteer in Englewood, and now she runs this thing called RAGE, which is the big community organization in Englewood. And so those people are everywhere. We met a woman in Florida. She's helping the kids across the street after elementary school. And we asked her, do you have time to volunteer in your neighborhood? And she said, no, I don't have time. And we said, are you getting paid for this? And she says, no, in the afternoons I just help the kids across the street. And then we said, well, what are you doing the rest of the day? And she said, well, on the Thursdays I cook food and bring it to patients in the hospital. We said, do you have time to volunteer? She said, no, I have no time at all. And she just thought that was being a neighbor. She didn't see it as volunteering. In DC, in Columbia Heights, there was a guy who takes the money in one of the parking garage. He has an obsession with city zoning rules. So if you have a problem in the city, you go to the guy in the parking garage and he helps you out with your city thing. Another one, a guy named Pancho Arguelles, we met in Houston, he has something called the Living Hope Wheelchair Association. He takes men who've been paralyzed in construction accidents, gives them diapers, wheelchair, catheters so they can lead dignified lives, trains them in social work. So you'll have 25 guys wheeling in your neighborhood in Houston, helping you with your neighborhood problems. And I once said to Pancho, you radiate holiness. And he said, no, I just reflect holiness, which is a good answer. And so I find we can all name these people, and a lot of the people in this room are such, who are rebuilding the social fabric, rebuilding trust every day. And they're literally everywhere. And so I do think there are forces of dehumanization ripping us apart from the top, but there are a lot of forces of humanization who are building us up from the bottom.
So you cannot have been doing what I've done for the years that I have and not have a whole bevy of stories, like you just said. But yet, it can't just be bottom up. I mean, I think there's a sense of urgency on this problem, and the reflection of what's happening at the top in our political leaders, in our social leaders, has created a lot of anxiety, a lot of concern. And so my question is, how do we make our leadership, especially our political leadership, reflect the goodness? Be those people who reflect the best of us. When you look at politics and you look at, loss of trust in institutions, guess what? We politicians run political ads calling people assholes all the time, right? I mean, think about it. I mean, that's our political narrative. So how do we fix that, David? I mean, I know you've given a lot of thought to what that looks like at the top as well.
Yeah, I mean, I love the Senate. I like senators.
It's a good thing.
A little egotistical sometimes. And if you fly back, if you fly out of Washington, where I live most of the time, on Thursdays and everybody's leaving to go home, you see them. You would not live that life for the glamour. The airplanes are filled with members of Congress, senators in first class, the House members in the back, and they're fundraising. You were probably going home to North Dakota all the time. It's just a hard, grueling life. They're in it for the right reasons, in my view. 70%. 2 decades ago, I was at 90%. They're in it because they want to make a difference. And I always tell young people, if you don't care about politics, that's because you're privileged enough to live in a society where you don't have to care about politics. Yeah. And I had a friend who died last year named, except for in Chicago, you definitely have to care about politics. But a guy named Mike Gerson was a friend of mine he was a speechwriter for George W. Bush, but he also was the champion of PEPFAR, the President's HIV initiative in Africa. And so that guy could say, I was instrumental in creating a program that saved 25 million lives. Mm-hmm. And so that's why politics matters. The incentive structure is terrible now. And so partly, we were talking about the table, when we had big money donations, you could go to a few people and they might have interest, but they were sort of realistic and moderate. Now when you raise money in $5 and $10 and $20 increments, you have to piss people off constantly to get those checks. And so the weird fact is that small money donations has driven people to the extremes. The primary system everybody knows about. It used to be that there were members of the House and the Senate who were workhorses or show horses. Now the route to power is show horse. Look what Marjorie Taylor Greene has been able to do in a relatively short period of time, just to get attention and attract power. And so how do you overcome that? I do think some of the open primary systems, jungle primary systems, I think there are some structural reforms. But fundamentally, it's up to the American people to morally police their own side and to say, if you're a liar, I may agree with you on every issue, but I'm not going to vote for you. I mean, this is how we would all run our businesses. We would not hire liars, even if we agreed with them on the issues. If you are a demagogue who's threatening democracy, that comes before what I think about the marginal tax rates. And so, And frankly, you know, I wrote my last book. I've written a whole bunch of books on moral formation and character. I wrote a book years ago called The Road to Character. And I learned actually writing a book on character doesn't give you good character. And even reading a book on character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book on character does give you good character. So recommend that to everybody. But, you know, this last book, and I really felt this in the core of my soul, one of the reasons we have low social trust is because people feel invisible and they feel unheard. And so the book was really an attempt to, how do you make people feel seen, heard, respected, and lit up? And one of the things that, you know, these are basic social skills. How do you become a great listener? I have a buddy who lives in Pennsylvania, and when you're talking to him, it's like talking to a Pentecostal church. He's like, yes, yes, amen, preach that, preach that. Just love talking to that guy. He's a great listener. And then just the ability to ask great questions. You know, everybody in this room once had the ability to be a tremendous question asker. I know that because you were all formerly 4 years old, and kids are phenomenal question askers. I like to tell a story about a woman I know in New York named Naomi Way, who teaches 7th grade boys how to ask questions. And so the first time she taught this, she got in front of the room and she said, okay, ask me any question, I'll answer it honestly. And so the first boy said, are you married? And she said, no. And the second boy said, are you divorced? And she said, yes. And the third boy said, do you still love him? And she was like, whoa. And then the fourth boy said, does he know? And she, your kids know. And they were like at her. And that basic skill, I don't know when you're in the Senate, the basic skill of asking people questions and really listening to their life stories. People, this is what I do for a living. I ask people questions. How many times has anybody ever said to me, none of your damn business? Yeah. 0. Because people are dying to tell their stories. And as long as we're invisible objects to one another, it's going to be really hard to rebind the country.
Well, I want to pick on your profession a little bit, if that's okay. Because I think when you look at what's happened in social media has led people to believe that I can be famous tomorrow. People who otherwise would never have any opportunity to go viral, any opportunity. And when you aren't, I think in some ways, people feel like diminished. And so at the same time that this happening, what you see, here's a great example. Jerry Seinfeld just did a graduation speech at Duke. What happened were a number of students got up, protested, and then they walked out. The vast majority of students stayed in their seats, were grateful for the message that he delivered, but yet the lead on his speech was Jerry Seinfeld protested. So how much do journalists and media, how much blame should we assign them in this new era of despair?
0. No, I'm kidding. It's funny. For my sins, I gave 3 commencements in 3 days last weekend. And they were different ones. I want to reassure I do honor. I wrote 3 different speeches. But I had, because I've been living in media world, I was prepared for protests and walkouts and things like that. And there was none of that. People were just happy. They were so glad for their kids. It was extremely normal. And if you look at the number of people who've been arrested for protests, it's like 0.1% of college students. And if you ask voters age 18 to 29, what are your issues do you care about? Israel-Gaza ranks 15th out of 16. Yeah. If you ask college kids the issues they care about, just those, Israel-Gaza way down. And so if you looked, and I fell for this, if you looked just at the media, you'd have a completely distorted view of what's going on college campuses. And the blame I would assign to my own profession is that as our landscape became more competitive, we learned that to generate clicks, anger and fear work best.
Yep.
And so the number of headlines denoting anger or fear I think it's up by 150% over the last 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
And so we also, in my profession, have a broken theory of social change, which is that we solve problems by reminding everybody how bad things are. And then we don't have to cover the people who are actually fixing the problems. And so as I've traveled around the country talking to the people I described earlier, the weavers, I have really had trouble getting media to cover some of the most compelling and wonderful stories because people think, yeah, we don't do that. We do, here's your problem. And so I do assign us some blame for the level of self-fulfilling pessimism there is in the country.
Well, I think if you step back and say, is it worse than it was in the 60s? Those of us who lived in the 60s might say no. But I lived in the 60s, and I feel less optimistic about what the future can bring, because where before the Senate would be full of leaders, big personalities, self-assured, were not getting up in the morning and looking in the mirror and seeing the next president of the United States. They just wanted to represent their states and get things done. That's not what we're seeing right now in the United States Senate. That this is the least productive Congress in the history of forever. It is full of people who are in the world of performance, right? Where they want that click. You know, just like the news wants the click, they want the click. And what drives that click is fear-based, you know, and going back to what's happening on campuses. What ignited the public attention was congressional hearings. Bringing college presidents in front and lecturing them, that gets you a lot of attention. So let's bring in some more college presidents, you know, at a time when they're just trying to manage what they've got. And, you know, that's not to say that we should diminish the feeling that people have of insecurity, especially Jewish students. I mean, we need to be realistic, but this is being driven, again, by that top down, whether it's big media or whether it is people in Congress who, you know, are exploiting this point in time for political gain. And so my question is, what is the vaccination to that? How do we inoculate our people from feeling that despair when the statistics that you've given us are just kind of overwhelming that this isn't, you know, front of mind for many young people?
Yeah, first I'll give you my experience of the 60s, 1968. My parents were pretty left-wing. They took me to a thing in New York in Central Park called a be-in, where hippies would go just to be. And one of the things they did was they set a garbage can on fire and they threw their wallets into it to demonstrate how little they cared about money and material things. And so I was 5, and I saw a $5 bill on fire in the garbage can. So I broke from the crowd, reached in the fire, grabbed the money, and ran away. That was my first step over to the right. And then I did, the introduction, I did debate Milton Friedman on TV, and this would have been 1983, and I was pretty left. And you can go on YouTube and type in Milton Friedman, David Brooks, and you'll see me with big hair back then, 1980s glasses, gigantic 1980s glasses that were apparently on loan from the Mount Palomar Lunar Observatory. And the show is basically me saying something that I'd read in some left-wing textbook, Milton Friedman destroying me in about 6 seconds, and then the camera lingering on my face for the next 25 seconds as I tried to think of something to say. So anyway, I think I would disagree with you. I think the 60s were worse. I think if you take the assassinations, you take the riots, in the early 70s, there were 4,000 bombings on college campuses every year. Really, you had a lot of social indicators moving in extremely wrong directions. Rising crime, rising divorce, just a lot of social breakdown. And I happen to think we had to go through the 60s, but it looked pretty hopeless back then. I think the one thing where I do agree with you, in the late 60s, early 70s, we did have a political leadership class that still believed that if I, as a Republican senator, am governed by a Republican president who broke the law, it's my job to go in and tell him to resign. And that part has gone away.
Well, when you think about where we are right now, anywhere from 60 to 70% of the public is dissatisfied with their choice of national leadership, of president. This is a system that people feel is not reflective of what the needs are in the country. Today, I think, is the first time in our history where our interest payment on the national debt is going to exceed our payment for defense. Think about that, and think about the trajectory going forward. We have big systemic problems in this country, whether it's aging demographics and healthcare costs, whether it's taking a look at our debt and deficit, whether it is just simply making sure our kids are educated and ready for the next iteration of what's going to happen in the world. And yet we have people who would rather talk about things that have absolutely, in Washington, that have absolutely nothing to do with real people's problems. And that's the frustration. I mean, before, when you look at the 60s, you think about Bob Dole, you think about George McGovern. Dole McGovern actually worked together, created a program that's feeding millions of children globally. And that relationship that people had of getting things done seemed more optimistic back then than when you look at, can our leaders help us out of this right now?
Yeah, well, first when you mentioned Dole, one of my favorite Doles, he was a very funny guy. And one of my favorite Dole stories was after he lost his race for the presidency, he was asked, is it painful to have lost a presidential campaign? He said, no, I sleep like a baby. I wake up every 2 hours screaming. I'm trying to be Mr. Pollyanna here. I happen to think Joe Biden is to my left and is governed to my left, but I happen to think his main job as president was to redirect a lot of money to people without college degrees. And I think he did that successfully in a big-time way. And so if you look at the Infrastructure Act, the CHIPS Act, those are big pieces of legislation. And I have a buddy who tells me he was the greatest mayor in the history of the city of Chicago, a guy named Rahm Emanuel. And he's now actually charming the Japanese. I would have thought Rahm and Japan would not go together, but they love him. They love him. But he had put together a chart which I found fascinating, which was the number of mega investments in manufacturing plants in America, where they are. And these are big, $800 million and above investments. And only 2 are in California, but 5 were in Illinois, 6 are in Iowa. I was in near Columbus, and they got a new, I think, Intel plant going in there. Upstate New York, they've got a new Micron plant going in up there. And so if you're looking where the major investments are going, they're going to the places where deindustrialization hit. And that's partly because of the CHIPS Act, but partly just because of business investment anticipating the CHIPS Act. And so I think this last Congress, obviously, it's been non-productive, but the first year of the Biden term, I think there were a lot of big things passed. And some of them I wish had stuck around. The child tax credit, I'm a big fan of.
Yeah.
Cut childhood poverty by 50%. And so for all the dysfunction, at least that part got done. Now, why Joe Biden is not getting credit for it is a more complicated question. But I do think...
I think he needs you as his campaigin manager. You're doing pretty good here.
Yeah, this is not a role I anticipated I would ever be in.
If you look at everything that you just said, but yet consumer confidence, it's ticking up a little bit. So people are feeling more optimistic. And the irony is that when you ask people, do you feel like your condition for your family has improved? A lot of people say yes, but then they give the economy bad marks. And so it's this anomaly about, why is it when you look at the jobs report, you look at all the macroeconomic numbers, we have a growing economy, better than most industrialized, allied countries. Why are people feeling this despair? Why isn't that being translated in how we feel about the direction of the country?
Yeah, I guess one thing I'd say is look globally. Look at Macron's numbers in France, look at the British Conservative Party, look at pretty much all the comparable leaders in the world. Some of these leaders have approvals in the 20s. And so what's happening is a global phenomenon. And if you want my one version of what's happening, why global populism is rising all around the world, it's the systems that I'm deeply implicated in. Basically, we had highly educated people go to schools like Chicago and Northwestern and Duke and UCLA and USC and Stanford, marry each other, invest massively in their own kids. So the average college-educated parent spends an average of $5,000 per kid per year just on extracurriculars, just on like team sport, travel sports. And those kids who are massively well, they're way ahead of other kids. So they get to go to Chicago and Stanford and Harvard. And then they marry each other, and then they move to the same 15 cities. And these 15 cities, which have like some small percentage of the American populace, control about 72% of the American GDP. And so basically we've created an inherited meritocratic class. Mm-hmm. And 80% of the country looks at the top 20% and say, those people have too much cultural power, they have too much media power, they have too much corporate power, and they look down on us. Yeah. And that's not only happening here, that's happening in France, that's happening in the UK, it's happening in Hungary, it's happening in places like Estonia and some of the countries that have just re-elected populists. And so this is just a global phenomenon. And I'm as big an anti-Trump person as it's possible to be. And believe me, I missed Trump in 2015. I wrote about 60 columns saying, don't worry, Donald Trump will never get the Republican nomination for president. I was living in DC, my social life was in New York, and I was teaching at Yale. And I was riding the Acela up and down, like, how could I be out of touch with America? I don't know how. Well. But I now think it's significantly more likely than not that Donald Trump will be elected. But it's part of this global phenomenon with deep cultural roots in the way the modern economy has restructured social and political and cultural power.
Yeah, trust me, I didn't miss Donald Trump. Yeah. You can't live in North Dakota and drive around. Western Minnesota tends towards the old progressive populist, the old school kind of populist. And you couldn't find a Hillary sign in Western Minnesota. And you remember that race was fairly close. And so if you got out there, you saw this happening, but you saw people who would never have, they wouldn't want that person who doesn't tell the truth. They wouldn't want a person who you couldn't trust their handshake, a person that's stiff small business. They would never want that person as their neighbor, but yet they're willing to take that vote. And that's something that is so interesting to me, because when I grew up in politics, two sins. You couldn't tell a lie, or at least get caught telling a lie, and true, and you couldn't be a hypocrite, right? So Donald Trump started life as very pro-choice, then switched, and now I guess he's switching back, because as a friend of ours said, the exceptions now are rape, incest, and falling poll numbers. And so when you look at it, that's the thing and this is probably the pivot point for us, because you've written a lot about character and the importance of character and why it is that we need to have character-driven leadership, but yet the public doesn't seem to be very hungry for character-driven leadership. Why not?
Yeah, well, let me tell you, after I got Trump wrong, I now spend probably 3 days a week traveling around the country. I go to 35, 40 states every year. And so I'm in South Dakota. This would have been 2018 or so. And I'm with a guy.
The Lesser Dakota.
The Lesser Dakota. And I call you would call what I do is going to a bar. I call it reporting. And so I meet a guy who's 70. Yeah. And we're talking, he's a big Trump supporter. And so I ask him why. And he said, let me tell you about the best day of my life. It happened 35 years ago. I was at a plant that made, I think, the casings for refrigeration units. And they laid me off because they had changed the technology in the plant, so I was no longer qualified to manage a little section of the workforce. And so he says, I went to my office, and I packed my stuff up in a box, and I was just going to leave quietly. And he gets up, opens the door to his office, and there in front of him is a double row of people, 3,600 people, all the employees of the plant, forming a double row from his office door through the plant, out the parking lot, to his car door. And so he walks out as they're applauding him and thanking him for being such a wonderful guy. And he said, every job I've had since then, the ensuing 35 years, has been worse, lower pay, more insecurity. My mother-in-law is really sick. We can't afford what she's going through, so we have to stay home every day of the year. And so he said, that guy might be a jackass, but I need a change. And so I wouldn't agree, I wouldn't vote the way he did, but I understand where he's coming from. And so a lot of people when I used to come to the Midwest, this is not so much true of Chicago, but more rural parts of the Midwest. 20 years ago, people would say, oh, you people think we're flyover country. That would happen to me once a day. Now it happens to me 7 or 8 times a day. And so the feeling of left behind, ignored, disdained is just a palpable and a real feeling. And I totally don't blame people. I understand where they're coming from. And so if you have a siege mentality that the world's out to get you, of course you want an asshole on your side. And I think that's part of the psychology here. But I should say, one of the things I'm a little suspicious of is people like me psychologizing Trump voters.
Yep.
I mean, it's just a blunt fact, like go back to Politics 101. Which candidate do you trust on the economy? Donald Trump has a huge lead. Which candidate do you trust on immigration? Donald Trump has a huge lead. Which candidate do you think is a more effective manager? Donald Trump has a huge lead. If politics is just who do you think will be better for your family, right now Donald Trump is well rated by the American public.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is this push-pull of people. People think Trump voters like him. I don't think that's necessarily true. I know a lot of Trump voters who don't like him, who say, I like his policies. And then I'll walk through why I think that it may not be the right direction. But we have always been a society that rewards character. We honor it, we write about it, we do biographies, we read about it. You've written how many books about character and morality and connecting people, but yet that's not what it seems like we're headed in this vote. Why not?
Yeah, like I said, people who feel under siege want a monster on their side. But I do think at the end, I mean, I still defend character. I mean, I think what we need in this room and in the Capitol is ethical leadership. And what does ethical leadership looks like? I start with the gospel of Ted Lasso. He was asked the first season, what's your goals for your football team, a soccer team? And he said, my goal is to make these fellas better versions of themselves on and off the field. And that's what an ethical leadership does. When I was a young TV pundit, I worked for a guy named Jim Lehrer. And when the first 10 years on the PBS NewsHour, when I said something he thought was good, I could see his eyes crinkle with pleasure. And when I said something he thought was bad and crass, I could see his mouth downturn with displeasure. And so for 10 years, I chased the eye crinkles and tried to avoid the mouth downturn. And in that way, he never said to me anything. But through those minor gestures, I could see he created a moral ecology. This is how we do things on the NewsHour. This is the NewsHour way of doing things. And he spread that message not just to me, but to everybody. And he's been dead a number of years, but the moral ecology he created is living and breathing today because he set an example. And I was once writing about how hard it is to teach moral character in a classroom. And I got an email from a guy named Dave Jolly, who was a veterinarian out in Oregon. And he says, never forget that what a wise person says is the least of that which they give. What gets communicated is the smallest of their gestures. And he says, never forget the message is the person. And so Ted Lasso's fictional, but Mr. Rogers, the message is the person. Remember when Pope Francis first came in, and people just saw a guy who lived like Jesus, and they liked it, whether they were Catholic or not. The message is the person. Another example of moral ecology, I've got to say that since we're in Chicago, is I hope everybody has seen, and if not, you should go YouTube it, Ryan Sandberg's 2005 Hall of Fame speech. And he says, I just played the game the way you were supposed to play it. When you get a hit, put your head down and run for second. Don't swing for the fences every time up. Just know how to move a runner over to third base. Know how to bunt. And he gave this speech, and all the other Hall of Famers were sitting up with him. And he said, these guys played the game the way it was supposed to be played. I just tried to do what they did and never disrespect them or the game or your opponent. And so that's an example of a guy absorbing from the senior generation just a certain way of doing things. And I'm going to do that. And I wish I could think of a White Sox example to balance this off. But.
Yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying, David, but that's not what we're seeing, right? This idea that character-driven leadership will drive great policy, more equitable policy, address the income disparity, and I think we talk so much about income disparity, but I think you mentioned it's a wealth disparity. It's a generational, year after year, people feeling like, here's a great example. My daughter, obviously went to the University of Chicago, which is how I ended up here, loving this program, loving the IOP, so I saw the advantages that she had. She has a very talented high school friend who is first generation. She made some bad choices on student loans, and she is just buried under in debt, and her parents can't afford to bail her out. My daughter ended up having a huge head start in life, equally talented. How do we fix that in order to bring back, I think, a common American identity that is hopeful about the next generation's opportunities?
Yeah, well, I think there are two political parties, but three political tendencies in American history. There's a more conservative tendency that believes in limited government to enhance freedom, and a more progressive tendency that believes in a larger government to enhance equality. But there was a third tradition which goes back to one of my heroes, Alexander Hamilton, who was a Puerto Rican hip-hop star from New York City. And that tradition believes in limited but energetic government to enhance social mobility. And so Hamilton believed in creating capital markets and capitalism so there would be a dynamic economy so poor boys and girls like him could rise and succeed. That tradition goes into the Whig Party, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. Then a young Whig politician named Abraham Lincoln follows in that tradition. And Lincoln gave more speeches on railways and the need for an Illinois state bank than he did on slavery over the course of his career. He really wanted to create a system where young boys and girls could rise and succeed. And then that goes up, I think, to Teddy Roosevelt as the next person in that tradition. And now I think I'm myself as a Whig, and now there are 6 of us left. But I do think that tradition just enhancing social mobility. And what does that look like now? It looks like massive investments in human capital. There's a great organization in Chicago called the Ounce of Prevention on early childhood education. And then some of the community colleges here have been doing fantastic work. And so building human capital is like it's like nutrition. You got to do it every day, and it has to come from multiple sources and multiple communities. But again, I think we're seeing some increases in social mobility, especially among, frankly, some of the Hispanic and Latino communities. There was a guy who I quoted earlier tonight, Samuel Huntington, who wrote a book called Who Are We? And the main argument of that book was Hispanic and Latino communities are not assimilating like past immigrant groups. And by assimilating, he meant being socially mobile, not cultural assimilation. He couldn't write that book today because the education levels are higher than whites, the incarcerations are lower than whites. It's a tremendous good luck story. The immigrant groups continue to do very well. And that doesn't solve a lot of the inequities that you just described. But I do think one of the things that we have to think about, those of us who are on the privileged side of the educational lines, is our kids have such a massive advantage. The average college-educated parent if you include in-kind investments like taking the kids on European vacations, taking them to museums, it's a $10 million investment in each child. And who's going to be able to compete with that? And so, to me, one of the things that we have to do is the history of the meritocracy is the history of different definitions of the word merit. We happen to define merit in this country by the ability to do well on standardized tests and please your teachers between 18 to 15 and 25. That's just a crazy way to define ability in this country. And we need to broaden it to include the things that actually matter in life. Are you a lifelong learner? Are you a good team player? Do you have character? And so we measure and sort people in the cheapest way possible by test scores. But test scores are not a good predictor of who you are and how you're going to do in life. And so I just think it's tremendously important that we widen the.
Well, and we can have that kind of intellectual conversation about what we need to do and the disparity. I had an exercise that I used to do, which I would ask people, how many of you think there's enough resources in this country to give every child an opportunity for a quality education and food security? Enough resources in the entire country, right? How many of you think that's going to happen? And then I would say it's about leadership. It's about prioritizing. It's about how we look at those other kids. And I think a really interesting debate that's going on right now is the student loan debate. And they're going to pick the kid who, maybe got a $100,000, art history degree and say, why should he get out of it? But I'm going to go back to Jasiah, my daughter's high school friend who's teaching in a junior high in West Fargo, can't afford daycare because she doesn't get paid enough, and she's crippled by student debt. Wouldn't it be great to give her an opportunity? And so why is there so much unwillingness to think about that next generation and what we can do that will help give people, equalize this difference between the elites and between maybe that first generation student?
No, we're spending too much on old people.
He's not getting elected to anything.
Yeah. Remember Danny Rostenkowski getting chased into that car? Do you remember that? Wow. I hope I'm faster than the old people in this room. It will take student-led. I'm not a super big expert, but I've thought a bit about it. Problems are hard. And so I understand the argument against forgiving debt. Why should the vast majority of people who have no four-year degree subsidize some of the people who do? And where I came out on it was we should forgive some of the debt for those people who are Pell eligible. And so focus it on those who are really needy. But that's not what got passed. They went all the way up the income scale in order to attract votes. And so to me, we would focus the money on the people who really need it, we would do a lot better. But it's also true, frankly, that throwing money at problems doesn't always solve your problems.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of these students are paying 6-7% interest when the interest rate was less than 1%.
Right. The ones who got hammered were the people who took out the debt that weren't able to complete their college for one reason or another.
Well, I want to ask you maybe kind of a difficult question, which is I'm going to put you back at the University of Chicago. You're a 20-year-old celibate student, and you meet you today. What do you tell that college student about, what words of wisdom do you give to yourself, looking backward?
Yeah, I say if anybody saw that movie, Fiddler on the Roof, you know how warm and huggy and emotional Jewish families can be, always singing and dancing. I come from the other kind of Jewish family. And so the slogan in our household was, think Yiddish, act British. And so we were stiff upper lip, clever. And then I went into this profession, which was a lonely profession. So at 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear and decided I want to become a writer. And writing became the center of my identity even at age 7. And I remember in high school I wanted to date this woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me. She dated some other guy. And And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. So those were my values.
We're starting to see a pattern here.
Yeah. And so I think when I got to Chicago, you know, it was super cerebral, even more than it is now, frankly. Yeah. Chicago's changed a lot in the ensuing decades. But I think a kind of emotional reserve became my default way of going through life. And so I was not the sort of person through much of my adulthood who anybody would confide in. Because I was aloof, I was a little socially uncomfortable with emotion. And so I would have said to that kid, if you cut yourself off from intimate emotional connection and spiritual awareness, you're cutting yourself off from the holy sources of life itself. And I think what changed me a little was, you know, I wanted to be more emotionally open, so I wrote a book about emotion in good University of Chicago fashion. I should add, when I was at Chicago my freshman year, we entered my roommate in the Chicago Golden Gloves competition, a boxing competition, and we gave him a nickname, the Kosher Killer. And then he'd never boxed a day in his life. And so we practiced the University of Chicago way. We didn't actually try boxing, but we read a lot of books about boxing. His illustrious career lasted 29 seconds. But, you know, life tends to soften you, and especially for a guy. So I went through a hard period about 11, 12 years ago. And there was a divorce, my kids were leaving, and I was doing what any male idiot would do, was trying to work my way through the problem. Work is a fantastic way to try to avoid what you're actually going through. And so I was at I lived in this little apartment in DC, and if you went to the spot in my kitchen, I wasn't having anybody over, where there should have been silverware, there was just Post-it notes. And where there should have been plates, there was just stationery. And that's like, that little image remains in my head as a symbol of a life excessively devoted to work and hiding from emotional availability. And I learned that there's a guy named Paul Tillich, a theologian, who said, the moments of suffering in your life interrupt your life and remind you you're not the person you thought you were. And he says they carve through what you thought was the floor of the basement of your soul, and they reveal a cavity below. And they carve through that floor and they reveal another cavity below. And when you go through those moments, whether it's grief or a cancer scare, or the illness of a child, you see deeper into yourself than you ever saw before, and you realize only spiritual and relational food will fill that hole. And so I sort of was pulled into dedicating myself to that kind of inner work. And then I've learned when you're in a valley, you can't pull yourself up. Somebody has to pull you out. And so it was like 2014, 2015. I was invited over a couple's house named Kathy and David. And I go over there, and Kathy and David had a friend named son named Sante, who was in the DC public schools. And Sante had a friend named James, whose mom had some issues, so that she couldn't always feed or house her son. So they said, well, James can stay with us. And then James had a friend, and that kid had a friend, and that kid had a friend. And so by the time I go over there to dinner, there's 15 mattresses spread around the house and 40 kids for dinner, teenagers. And so I walk in the first day, and I reach out to shake my hand to the first kid I met. I call them kids, but they were like 17. And he says, we're really not allowed to shake hands here. We just hug here. And I'm not the huggiest guy on the face of the earth, but I did. And they beamed emotional openness, and they beamed love at you, and they demanded you beam it back. And they were like an education. And I had dinner with those group for every Thursday for about 6 years. We vacationed together, we had holidays together. And it was the kind of community that you find, and that really is transformational. And I think it's had some effect. I say in my most recent book, I'm not an exceptional person, but I am a grower. And I've been interviewed twice in my life by Oprah. I've been lucky enough to have that happen twice. And after the second interview in 2019, she says to me, David, I've rarely seen somebody change so much in middle age. You were so emotionally blocked before. And she's Oprah, I mean, she should know, right? And the final proof that change is possible is that I'm at this conference in Nantucket about a year or two ago, And it's in a meeting room, and there are about 500 of us in the audience, and the speaker hands us all pieces of paper which have lyrics to a love song on it. And he says, okay, find someone you don't know, gaze into their eyes, and sing the love song at them. And if you had asked me to do that 15 years ago, I would have spontaneously combusted. But I did it, and it's like, okay, you can change. You can try to be a little more huggy and emotionally open. And so I would have...
Those are lovely stories, but it's easy. No, I mean, you grow, but when you look at the statistics about students, and I'm so grateful that you came to the University of Chicago. They're blessed to have you back on campus. I am just grateful that every day I get to meet with incredible students who make me, if you ask me why I'm optimistic, is because I've met the next generation. They're a lot smarter than we are. They're a lot more principled than we are, and they're looking for answers, and they want to get things done.
I knew I'd bring out the optimism in it.
Yeah, I do. But you know, people always say, oh, they're, you know, those kids, they're this. And I go, no, have you met them? Have you met, they just assume that they're all like, you know, they aren't thinking, and they aren't listening, and they're not doing. And that's one thing that we insist. At University of Chicago, they're listening and they're thinking. At the Institute of Politics, we make them do stuff. So that's an amazingly optimistic opportunity that I have every day to be inspired by the next generation. But they can't do it alone. And they don't have the power right now to do it alone. And so give us just some way that we can walk out of here believing that the leadership in this country is going to be as good as the people you've described, and will grow and develop and make our country what it can be for the next generation.
Yeah, so I mentioned at the very start the low social trust is the thing I worry about the most. So I called around to a bunch of social scientists who said, I said, well, tell me about a society that really suffered a decline in trust and then built it back up. They were like, I haven't really seen that. So, but then
This is supposed to be the optimistic part, David.
But then I asked historians, and they said, and there's a guy, Putnam at Harvard, who said, yeah, I think the time we should look at is a time between 1870, 1880, and 1910. And so, in the 1870s, it was a lot like today. We had a lot of economic turmoil. There was big waves of immigration. There was a big economic transition, which was industrialization. And so 3 things happened. And I don't want to glorify the 1890s, because for a lot of people, the 1890s were a time of lynching and incredible racial terrorism. So I'm not saying America was perfect in the 1890s, and we should be conscious of that. But I do think a couple things happened, which is first, there was a cultural shift from social Darwinism, which was a super sharp-elbowed thing, to the social gospel movement, which was more communal. And then you saw a rise of civic renaissance. So you had in this city, the settlement house movement, Jane Addams, Hull House. You had the environmental movement. You had the NAACP. You had the Boys and Girls Clubs, the Boys and Girl Scouts. You had just the civic, all these new organizations sprang up in the 1890s, in part because America's institutions had been designed for people living in rural Kansas, and suddenly you had 1 million young people in Chicago or Philadelphia or Cleveland. And so then that happened, and then you had, in the 1900s, you had the progressive movement to clean up government. So the change was cultural, civic, and then political. And there's a very similar movement that happened in Britain between 1810 and 1848. Again, there was a cultural shift, then the civic, and then political. And so that seems to me a realistic sequence. And I think we're in the middle of a cultural shift as people become aware, even like the Surgeon General, people become aware of all the problems you've described and the problem of low social trust, alienation, despair. And then I think we're in the middle of a civic renaissance. I mean, this organization is older, but all these people, and especially the young people, they want to serve communities. And then I think eventually we'll get to a political renaissance. But I think you got to do the spiritual and cultural and civic groundwork before you can get to the political change. It just can't start there, I'm afraid.
Yeah. So the hard work begins. Thank you so much, David Brooks, for your wonderful presentation. You were fabulous. Absolutely fabulous.
Thank you.